Hello, this is Charles Scoville, your Golden Harvest agronomist with your Agronomy in Action Focus Friday here on the 2nd of August, 2024. So today we're going to change things up a little bit on our format, and we're going to look at both the crop progress and agronomy questions for the week by crop. And because of everything going on right now, I think we're going to just forego having a guest speaker join us this week. So let's get started first talking about corn. So again, I checked the MSU's EnviroWeather site, and our crop progress continues to be ahead of normal. If we look across the state, starting in East Lansing, we're about 58 heat units above the 5-year average. In Allegan, we're 53 units above. Now, when we jump down to the Deerfield, Blissfield area, actually 81 heat units above normal. Even into the thumb, we're 80 units above normal. And Ithaca, probably the most ahead of all at 85 units above normal. So the question is, what does that really mean in days? So if you take days like this last week with a high of, well, over 86, though we only count up to a high of 86, and low is really only down around 70, we can accumulate about 28 heat units a day. So, that's about 3 days ahead for those areas that are way ahead. But if we look towards next week and kind of what we've got coming at us as we get into fall, if you take a high of 74 and maybe a low in the upper 50s, that only gives us 15 to 16 heat units a day accumulation. So looking at that, we'd be 5 days ahead of normal in some of those areas, down to 3.5 days ahead of normal, where we're only 50 units ahead. But again, ahead is ahead, and we will take that this year. So let's get into some of those hot topics for the week on corn. So I am still getting questions about tar spot, of course. Questions this week about what about irrigated corn? We're up to 17 counties reported in the state of Michigan right now. But if you think about irrigated corn, I just can't help but think back to years previous where we'd see those drone shots and the circle is just dead and it's actually green in the corners. And so we want to avoid that the best we can. So, if we are going to run those irrigators, we got to run them just as with as much quantity of water as we possibly can without creating too much runoff there, and then just apply them less often with more amounts. And then it's not a bad idea if you have the ability to just apply fungicide right through that pivot. It can be done, but of course, in that case, we're going to run that pivot as fast as we possibly can so we can just get that fungicide on and not create a lot of additional runoff of the fungicide through the crop there. So it does take a little bit of additional management, but what a great resource if we do have irrigators out there. I actually got 2 calls this week on... they're saying we got these dark spots right at the base of the leaf. I wonder what kind of disease or what's going on in there. And, we don't normally see that because we're just not normally out in the corn this time of the year. But what that is in most cases is simply pollen stain. So if you think about it, that pollen's all raining down on those leaves. We get a little rain and that washes that pollen down into that spot where the leaf attaches to the stem. And that stalk starts to change color. But if you peel back that leaf, you'll notice that it's just surface stain and there's no disease at all going on out there. But certainly that something cosmetic like that gets people's attention. And I'm just excited that people are out in the field checking these things out and seeing some of the things that are out in that field. I will say while we're out there, this is a great time to think about checking for pollination. All we have to do is go out, pick an ear. I like to cut off the butt end of that ear first and then run my knife down from the butt to the tip of that ear carefully and just remove that husk as easy as possible. And then just shake the ear. And if the silks release, then the kernel has pollinated. But of course, if the silk is still attached where that kernel is, then we haven't yet gotten the pollination to occur on that kernel. So, remember, pollination does start from the butt of the ear first and finishes at the tip of the ear. And, of course, as long as we have some fresh silks and coming and pollen falling, we can finish those tips, get those last few bushels out of this crop here. Now, of course, we've had some days in the 90s. It's been kind of hot, put some stress on this pollinating corn. But the good news is next week, with those temperatures in the highs of 70s, it's just going to be ideal for finishing the pollination, especially on some of those later planted fields that might still be pollinating. Of course, if we're seeing silk feeding out there from things like Japanese beetles or corn rootworm beetles, and we're still pushing silks, we may want to consider throwing some insecticide out there. We got to keep at least a half an inch of fresh silk there at the tip of that ear in order to continue to successfully pollinate. So, and then, of course, for those areas that have missed some rains lately, and there are some areas in Michigan like that, especially as we get up around that Ithaca Shepherd area, I'm seeing some corn showing drought stress. And, part of this is due to the fact that we've just got some really shallow root systems out there this year. We never really did have to chase the water for most of the area. And so, let's just hope we continue to get some regular rains out there and finish off this crop. Finally, on corn, if you do have some good looking golden harvest corn out there, and there is a lot of it, I just really want to encourage you to think about entering that into the National Corn Growers Association High Yield Contest this year. The beauty is we will pay for your entries, but they are due by the 14th of August. So if you're interested, make sure you give us a call and we can work out those details. Let's switch to soybeans now. Hot topics this week. It's been my worry for the past month that white mold is now showing up across the state. Last week I saw it in West Michigan. This week, found it in some fields up in the Thumb. And, remember, it's kind of funny, not really funny, but unfortunately, we only find white mold in the best looking soybean fields. You just don't go out there and see white mold in those poor looking fields. They're just lower to canopy, and then they get more air movement in and across there. So those poor looking fields they've got other problems, but white mold tends not to be one of those. The hardest part, of course, is that there is just no rescue treatment available for white mold at this point in the season. So the best thing we can do is evaluate the damage, understand that it's going to get a lot worse between now and harvest, and then we just need to adjust our marketing plan accordingly. But then, we need to reevaluate our plan for next year. So first, let's not put those fields back into soybeans. Second, let's select, more tolerant varieties for white mold, widen our rows if at all possible. We need to probably reduce our planting population out there to get more air in the canopy, and then, maybe plan for a burner type herbicide application early, or, a white mold specific fungicide application at that key R1 or first flower growth stage. Of course, that's usually in June, around that summer solstice, June 21st type of timing. Now, last year, beans that looked like truly the top yielding fields out there, but got infected with white mold. Unfortunately, they ended up the season with some of the worst yields. I saw some yields in the teens, in fact, in those fields. So expect that same thing this year, especially for fields that are starting to show white mold this early in the season. So I'm also seeing some areas in soybean fields with crinkled leaves. Very typical this time of the year. Of course, this is typically due to corn herbicide that volatilized and moved into our soybean fields and then, of course, set back down and get that drawstringy look on those leaves. The good news is that most of this damage is usually just cosmetic in nature and really rarely affects the yields negatively. So that's the good news there. I am also in some of these service calls finding some spots of wilted soybeans this past week. And of course, we got to never go into the field without a shovel in hand. And in this case here, it was actually caused by some compaction in those areas. And so if we see those areas like that and we do some digging and find those root compactions, whether it's sidewall or just compaction from tillage, not much we're going to do to fix that crop this year, but we do need to identify those areas, take some notes, and then, consider some tillage plans either this fall or next spring to alleviate those problem areas. Finally, as we wrap up the soybean discussion, I do want to also encourage you that if you've got some good looking golden harvest soybeans out there, to possibly enter those into the Michigan Soybean Growers High Yield Contest or our internal Go for the Gold Soybean High Yield Contest. We will pay for those entries too, but remember the entry deadline is coming up August the 30th. So let myself or your sales rep know if you want to get some of these enters in, and we'll be glad to give you some help. So with that, folks, I hope you've had a great week. This is Charles Scoville, your Golden Harvest Michigan agronomist, with your Agronomy in Action Focus Friday. Have a great weekend.